Good day, everybody. Randy Franklin Smith here, and today we're going to talk about how to track privileged accounts as they move laterally from computer to computer as a result of attackers harvesting their credentials using Mimikatz or any of the other credential artifact harvesting techniques that are out there. So today we're not looking so much at the techniques for stealing these credentials. We've discussed that in previous webinars. Today we're just talking about how to track this and detect it, and it's pretty cool. What I'm going to show you is actually fairly simple. It just requires some really good log management and collection and analysis in order to make it happen. And we're using LogRhythm to do that today. So you'll see more of LogRhythm throughout my webinar. And the way, what we're really talking about here is that since privileged accounts are such a major target of attackers, well, let's figure out how to exploit that. And this is how we do it. Let's think about this for a second. In a well-secured environment, privileged accounts are comparatively rare compared to end-user accounts, right? And that's true in most environments. On top of that, individually, privileged accounts follow fairly static usage patterns. If these are human-linked admin accounts, then Bob typically administers these systems, and Susan typically administers these systems. If this is a privileged account associated with a service or an application, then in most cases that's going to be even more static and more limited. So, on the other hand, think about the attackers. They want these privileged accounts. They get these privileged accounts by harvesting credential artifacts on each system where they gain access. So as soon as they break into or compromise another system on your network, they look at the artifacts left behind by previous and current logon sessions and then use those to gain access or gain the credentials to additional accounts. And then pretty much every subsequent computer that they laterally move to using one of these accounts, they're going to try the accounts that they've already captured. And so typically, attackers are not going to be aware of the normal usage patterns of where Bob's account or SQL Server's account is normally used. And so because of that, it's going to create anomalies in our logs if we know what to look for. And so that's what this is all about. So the first question might be, how do you know when a privileged user logs in? If NID 4624 is not going to help you in this case, here's an example of 4624. As you can see, the subject fields tell us who logged in. The subject actually is not the most useful thing in this event. It's the logon information and the new logon heading. So new logon, underneath that you'll see account name and account domain. That's what we really want to zero in on. That tells us who logged on, and what is missing though is the level of authority that the user had. There's no indication here that R. Smith is or is not a privileged user. So we need something a little bit better than that. It's not going to be practical to scan all of our 4624s and look at the username and then figure out from the username if the user is privileged or not. That would require a lot of LDAP analysis in addition. So it's not like it's impossible. It's not practical by any stretch of the imagination, though. So what else does the Windows Security Log offer us? Well, let's think about this. Here, in group policy, we have user rights. Now, some of these user rights are classified by Microsoft as admin equivalent, and by that they mean that the user right in question gives you the authority to either bypass certain controls or in some other way perform operations that even if you're not an administrator, you might as well be one. So here's just a few examples, like this one right here, act as part of the operating system. That is an admin equivalent right. That's kind of like being able to log on as root in Unix. Let's look for another one. Create a token object. So logon tokens, access tokens are something that go with your logon session, and they define, among other things, which groups that you belong to. So that is a privileged or admin equivalent right. Now, the next cool thing is whenever someone logs on with one or more of these admin equivalent rights, then Windows logs event ID 4672. So this is not, there's quite a few events in the security log pertaining to user rights. There's events that tell you when user rights are actually exercised or used. There's also events that tell you when user rights are granted or revoked. We're not talking about those events today. We're talking about an event logged at logon time if and only if the user has one or more of these privileged rights, or admin equivalent rights, I should say. And that then is our trigger for this. This basically tells us, well, not basically, it tells us whenever somebody with privilege logs on. And here's what the event looks like. 4672 simply says special privileges assigned to new logon. I'm not crazy about the wording. I wish it just says a privileged user logged on or a user with one or more special privileges logged on. Well, who logged on? That's shown to you right there with account name and domain. So this is a local user account because I can tell that the domain name is actually the name of a computer. So this is the local admin logging on. And as we would expect, admin has a lot of admin equivalent rights, including, here's another one, load device drivers, or the backup or restore right. That allows you to access any file or other object on the system regardless of your permissions. Okay, so we get a 4672 whenever a privileged user logs on. We can begin from there and start doing some analysis. Now, before we can do that analysis, of course, we have to be collecting the logs. And it's not sufficient to just get your domain controller logs. These events are not logged on the domain controller. Well, they are logged on the domain controller, but only when a privileged user logs on to the domain controller itself. But what about when you log on to another computer on the network? The domain controller may authenticate you, but the logon session occurs on the computer that you're gaining access to. So that means the whole bottom line here is that we need to be getting our logs from our servers, and really even nowadays, absolutely, our workstations as well. Now, if we do that, if we get these 4672s from those computers, here's what it tells you. It tells you the privileged user who logged on, and of course, where they logged on, the host. So you could say the who and the where. But let's make sure you understand the next thing, what 4672 does not tell you. It does not tell you the logon type. So is this somebody logging on at the console, at the keyboard and screen of this computer, whether it's a host or virtual system? Or is this a remote desktop logon? Is this somebody coming in over the network, like with a shared folder access? Or other network logons could be where you are coming in via WMI or a remote PowerShell session. Or is this just a service logon? So, of course, services, every service has an account, and whenever you start that service, Windows performs a logon on behalf of that process, and thus you have the service logon. Same way with scheduled tasks. If you program a scheduled task to start up at a certain time and run as account B, then that's going to show up as a batch logon type. Okay, and the important thing here is that 4672 does not tell you that very important piece of information. So how do we get it? Well, or maybe the next question then would be is what event gives you the logon type? That would be event ID 4624, which I'll show you here in a second. But how do you link 4672 to 4624? You do that with the logon ID. So notice back here in our example of 4672, one of the things that we have is logon ID. In this case, it's always hex 4B842. If we go and look at an example of 4624, that is the logon event. Here under new logon, one of the pieces of information we get is the logon session ID. So that's our correlation point right there. When we get a 4672, if we want to know the logon session type, was this at the keyboard and screen, was it remote desktop, was it network, was it service, then we've got to get the logon ID out of 4672 and look for a 4624 from the same computer, very, very close to the same time, pretty much the same time, of 4624, bearing the same logon ID down here in new logon. And be aware this has nothing to do with the logon ID up here under subject, because all of your logon events are handled by logon processes, and the subject here just is not important for our purposes. What we want to focus in on is the new logon heading. Okay, so 4672 is our starting point. If we want to know how the user logged on, the logon type, then we link to it 4624 logon ID as the correlation point. One of the other things that we would like to know is what processes did this user execute during their logon session? Well, 4688 tells us all of the programs that run on a system, and that's great, but we also need to be able to find that event, and it's the very same correlation point. It is logon ID again. So I'm going to show you an example of 4688, and then if we take the logon ID of a 4624 and then say, show me all my 4688s with that same logon ID, then we're going to know what programs were executed. And now that combined information is going to help us a lot to determine, is this a legitimate logon session or not? Now, folks, if you're wondering, well, how can I possibly investigate each one of these privileged logon sessions? No, you're not going to have to do that. We're going to show you some things that I've set up in LogRhythm, for instance, to help us zero in on the ones that are worth investigating. Okay, here is 4688. I'm using the Security Log Encyclopedia at my website here. Here's event ID 4688. A new process has been created, and look at the logon ID. So this is the same piece of information that we're starting with over in 4672, but what you're going to see is an instance of 4688 for every program that was executed during that logon session, and the new process name field shows you what that program did, or shows you the name of that program. Now, if we're interested in knowing any events logged while that program executed, that's its process lifecycle, then we would take the new process ID and then continue to search the log for other events that bore that same process ID. And that would then show us anything that program did which was also audited. Let me look at a couple questions here. Bobby asks, what does it mean when 4672 has an account name of DWM-something? I've seen that too. I have to, that's a domain window manager or something like that, device window manager. I'll have to look at that again, but that's some of the normal stuff that you see all the time and is probably not worth investigating. But if I have an opportunity, I'll look that up and refresh my memory on that. Bobby, the next question comes from Nate. The logon ID between 4624 and 4672 did not match in the slide, but are they supposed to in a real scenario? Yes, absolutely, Nate. I just grabbed copies of these events from the Security Log Encyclopedia, not from an actual investigation. Oh, Todd asks, is there any audit GPO options that need to be turned on to get your 4688s? Yeah, that's true for all of the events. And here's how you find that out. If you go up to the top of any event in the Security Log Encyclopedia, it shows you the subcategory that has to be turned on for audit success. And in the case of 4688, that would be process creation. Make sure you've got that audit subcategory turned on. And then there's other ones for logon and even for the 4672. I think that may be a different audit subcategory as well. In fact, that's really an on-target question. So let me give you a definitive answer. I'm going to go to 4672. Yes. 4672, that's our beginning place in today's webinar, is the special logon category. You'd need to have that turned on. And then finally, to get your 4624s, you would need to have the audit logon events category. So in summary then, over here in a group policy object, we need audit special login and audit logon. So special login is going to give us 4672, logon is going to give us 4624, and then under detailed tracking, process creation is going to give us 4688. Todd says, as process creation can fill up the logs, is there a best practice log size that should be set? Todd, you need to configure your logs as large as they can be. There's nothing wrong in having your logs max out at like half a gigabyte. But the biggest thing is you need to be getting these logs into a log management system. Leaving logs on the system where they are generated just compromises the integrity of your audit trail, because if someone breaks into a system, one of the first things they're going to do is erase those logs, the same way with a malicious insider. So you've got to get these logs off the system and into something like LogRhythm. Okay, a couple other questions here. Okay, great question, Brad. Is logon ID unique on each system, or will it be the same across the domain? So Brad, logon ID is fairly unique on each individual system. Don't expect it to be unique across your entire network. And it's not, as you noticed, I said it's fairly unique. So logon IDs can be repeated because it's just a number. This is especially true if you reboot a system. I don't think Windows keeps track of the last logon ID it used, and eventually it's going to run out of numbers and have to start over anyway. So this is something that is fairly unique, but when you are searching for a given computer within the past 24 hours, it's pretty unlikely that you're going to see a logon ID repeated for 2 different sessions. So usually within your observation window, if you are scoping by a host, then logon ID is going to be unique. Yung Chun asks, do batch jobs or system activities trigger 4672? If these activities do, logs could be heavy. So yeah, as I said, I'm going to show you some ways to zero in on the ones that are important. And Raphael says, if a process running as administrator, launches another process, would the second process also be linkable to 4672? Or would we need to track by the process ID? It depends. Generally, Raphael, they are all going to bear the same logon ID. But the safest way to link would be parent process to child process, which those are events that you'll see there. Bilal asks, isn't 4624 logged by default? You know, I do not spend any time worrying about what the default logon settings are in Windows. You should be taking complete and mandatory control of your audit policy settings. So don't ever base your security controls off of what you believe the default logon settings are. Okay, and then Tom says, do you have an example? Okay, yeah, we'll show you what I have. I'm not actually using AI rules in this case in LogRhythm. I'm just doing some stuff with the web console. So yeah, stay tuned. Okay, now, thanks for all those great questions. Keep them coming. Just to wrap up then, or catch up with where we are, 4672 is our starting point. It tells us that a privileged user logged in, and I think we're clear now on what it doesn't tell you and where you have to get that information from: a correlated logon event, 4624, or a process event, 4688. But you can't afford to do that on every 4672, so which 4672s should you work on? Well, first, here's just a quick slide that I added right before we got started to just visually show the relationship here. Notice one thing: there's a one-to-one relationship between 4672 and 4624. It would have been awesome if they just added this information to 4624, so we wouldn't have to make that correlation, but that's the way it is. On the other hand, you can go from 4672 to one or more 4688s. That's why I'm showing multiple ones here, and the correlation point remains logon ID. And then here's what each one tells you. So 4672 tells you the privileged user and the computer where they logged on. 4624 tells you the logon type. But hey, one other thing it tells you is the client computer. If this is a remote logon, then there's another computer involved. If it's RDP or network, why then 4624 is also hopefully going to tell you either the IP address or the NetBIOS name of the remote computer where the user was coming from. And when we're tracking lateral movement, that's super valuable, right? Okay, so what do we want to do? There's potentially lots of ways that you could analyze 4672, and a lot of it goes back to your particular environment and what you know about it. But here's the one that I'm going to focus in on, and that is simply looking for privileged sessions on computers where we've not seen them before, or privileged sessions involving user accounts that we haven't seen before. And you could do this with trying to build a whitelist, and for that would require an AI rule, and that would be if we're using LogRhythm, by the way. If we're using something else, there's lots. SIMs have most SIMs have some kind of list building capability, but what I'm going to focus in on is something a bit more simple, but I think it's a very good starting place, And it may be what you end up using quite a bit because it does not require the resources, both SIM-wise and maintenance-wise, of maintaining white lists. And then there's whenever you start trying to build white lists, there's a certain amount of overhead, both from the engineer and from a technology point of view. So what we're going to do is use the bottom capability of, instead of top X hosts or top 10 users, we're going to use the bottom 10 or bottom whatever within, say, a 24-hour or 12-hour period. And that's, of course, going to depend upon whether you have a 24-hour SOC or what your operational characteristics are. But let's at least figure our observation window would be 24 hours. And when we have, when we see, for instance, a user that is really uncommon showing up just once or for the first time in the past 24 hours, why then we can determine if we want to look at them more deeply. And what we want to then ask, and of course the answer is, where did they log on? How did they log on? Is this a scheduled task, or is this actually an RDP or a network logon session? What did they run once they were logged on, and so on. So let's go look at this over in LogRhythm. LogRhythm was kind enough to sponsor today's real training for free. So I'm going to use their technology to do this. And here's a dashboard that I've set up in LogRhythm just for privileged session analysis. And those of you that are LogRhythm experts could probably take this and do a lot more. But this is a good place to get started. And it's also something realistic that you could accomplish with maybe some other SIM if you own it. LogRhythm is super powerful with its analysis capabilities, but this is a good starting point. So here's the search that we're running. We're saying vendor message ID is 4672. So you know what that means. In LogRhythm, your event ID is called the vendor message ID. LogRhythm has a normalized data model that it maps all event logs to, and so that's what vendor message ID is. And then we're given this just a little bit of intelligence here, where you notice we say, and user origin is not $$. In LogRhythm, what that means is that the origin user name does not end in a $. Why do I do that? Because I don't want to see logon sessions, privileged logon sessions associated with the computer account. And you will see a lot of those for just the normal functioning of the operating system. We just don't care about that. That gets rid of it. This cleaned up the chart tremendously once once Bruce at LogRhythm showed me how to do that. And because now what you see here are just actual user account names instead of a bunch of computer accounts muddying the waters. And so what we're looking at then is, in the past day, who are my bottom administrators? Now this is a small environment, a small lab network, so we're seeing pretty much everybody who's logged on with privilege, but we're ranking them this way. And so look at admin service down here. That's like the least, it's the bottom one, meaning it has the fewest events. And I've taken the same information and I've plotted it over a trend line just so that I can see. It's not so much the line chart that I'm interested in here as it is being able to see just when these logons happen. So when did the admin service logon occur? There should be one blip in there for it somewhere. And it could be that it's just so uncommon it's not showing up, or it could just be that I'm not seeing it at this resolution well. But you see the idea. Now, the other thing that we're showing are the hosts impacted by this. So this is the computer where the logon occurred. Now, the one that I'm going to zero in on is Thomas Lengyel here. He's not necessarily the bottom, but I just know from some of the research I was doing this morning that it'll have a little bit more interesting information. And so what I can do is say, let's just limit this to Thomas Lengyel, this dashboard, by double-clicking on him. And voila, now my bottom host becomes more useful to me. There's really only one computer where Thomas Lengyel has been logging on, where he also has admin authority. And that's on the computer named H1 here. And I can see he logged on at about noon, at about 3 p.m., about 9 p.m., and so on, and then some more the next day. We would like to now be able to pivot and answer those other questions, such as, well, what kind of logon sessions were these, right? And what was he doing while he was logged in? And we can do that. Here are the 10 events, and for each one of them I can select one of these events and I can scroll down and for instance I can come over here to logon message and I can see that his logon session was F6B, etc. But I've also captured all of this right here. Now, it's in a trend line, but again, I'm not really trying to find a trend here. What I am getting are the logon session names, and it's just a shortcut for me because I can take one of these. I can take the one, I want to look at the most recent. So let's take this one right here, and I select it. And over here in the inspector, then under pivot, I can do a new search that says, show me everything, show me all events that we've collected with this logon session. And at this point, maybe I want to change to a different dashboard. And in a larger environment where this was where we were collecting more events, we would see the applications being used, other hosts associated with this one logon session. We would see the other events being logged with that bore the same logon session, such as all the processes that ran. And that's here where applications would also show up, showing us what programs he had executed. Now we can still do some of this. I want to look at the logon event. So this is the 4624 event that shows us when he logged on. I think it is anyway. Let's see if I got the right thing. Yeah, it sure is. So now what we've done is we have pivoted on the logon session ID, and we can come down here to logon type, and we see, Thomas logged into H1 remotely with logon type 3. So where was he coming from? He was over here on 1042.153. We could take then that piece of information, which is going to show up probably in one of the host fields. Let's see here. And we could pivot even on that to maybe compare that to DHCP logs to find out, well, who is 10 dot yada yada dot 53. But LogRhythm makes it really nice to start out with a dashboard that shows us our most uncommon privileged logon sessions, and then we can limit that down to just one user. Look at that. Look at whatever privileged logon sessions occurred there, and then select one of the fields, in this case logon session, pivot on that to then see what programs they ran, which computer did they come from, and what was the logon session type. Let's see here. Several people are asking for a copy of the dashboard. Yes, I'll be happy to provide a copy of that. I'll just have to get with the LogRhythm guys on how to export that, and then we'll include that in the follow-up email. No problem, Chris and Michael. So it's pretty nice. It's simple to set up. Now, of course, this does require that we keep an ongoing situational awareness. It means we've got to be looking at the dashboard on a regular basis. And that's one thing that you may end up doing too, is playing around with the observation window. I've got it set to 24 hours, but if you've got a SOC team who's watching stuff all the time, you might cut this down to 4 hours. You will probably also maybe start filtering this against some lists that you build. Perhaps you have lists of accounts that are just high noise, and you're willing to just filter them out because of the low likelihood that those accounts or hosts would be compromised. And there's lots of ways that you could customize this to your environment to make it more informative. So, I mean, it's really as simple as that. You want to watch your privileged user accounts. By the way, one thing that this is going to show you too, it's just automatically going to pop this up on your dashboard, is if somebody creates a new privileged user or takes a given user, gives it privilege, and begins using it, because they're not going to be high frequency used accounts, and therefore it's going to show up as one of your bottom, it's going to show up on that bottom percentile. And that's great, because the bad guys do this. They create backdoor accounts, or they take unprivileged accounts and that they've gained access to and give them privilege through some other account that they've compromised, and then switch over to using that account to try to fly underneath the radar. Just be aware of some limitations, as with anything. And that is, for one thing, that it's always possible privileged users could log on to a system where they don't specifically have privilege on that particular computer, right? So we can have an account named Bob or named SQL Server, and maybe on certain systems it's a member of administrators that has privilege, but that same account could be used by the bad guys elsewhere because they're not necessarily sure of who has what authority to what. And the way that, the way we're coming into our events here is via 4672. So that means we're specifically filtering out any non-privileged logons in the first place. It's not necessarily a bad thing, it's something you need to be aware of. It's also super helpful if you have a naming convention that separates end users, privileged human accounts, and privileged system accounts. Because then we can start using that in safe ways to do some extra filtering. For instance, if we see an account, let's say all of your end users begin with U-, just as a possibility in your naming convention. So if you suddenly see a U- account banging out a 4672, then that's something to check into right away, because why is that account privileged in the first place? So that's just one reason why I say naming conventions are useful. And isn't it interesting that it's not about top X, it's about bottom X? I think that's something that holds across the board with a lot of our threat hunting, is we're not looking for the most noisy, the loudest, the highest frequency. We're looking for the little whispers, the uncommon, and that's actually a lot of times the smallest number, not the biggest. Let's see here. So Walter, it all depends on what your log management solution is. Walter asks, how do we get our logs to one place? So LogRhythm supports a variety. That's what we're using today because they're the ones paying for today's real training for free. LogRhythm can go out there and remotely pull logs in. LogRhythm will allow you to install a system monitor agent on individual systems to send events, or LogRhythm will also support log forwarding, Windows event forwarding, which I've done webinars on that too. Let's see here. David says, wouldn't you want to check privileged use with non-privileged users to detect potential lateral movement by an attacker? So I think that's what I was talking about before, David, but if you can give me an example, maybe I can hone in on that more. You might have something good to share with everybody there. Tom says, would you be open to sharing? Yeah, everybody's asking for a copy of the dashboards. Yeah, we're totally going to do that. I just have to see exactly how. There's some things I know well in LogRhythm and others not. So I'll find out how to do that from one of the guys at LogRhythm, and just look in the follow-up email for that information, okay? So yes, the answer is yes, and stay tuned. Let's see here. But folks, what do you think about this? How many of you use that? Because so many default dashboards, just start off with, hey, here's your top users, here's your top hosts, here's your top this. I mean, that's useful if you're facing a, just a crazy onslaught attack, but that's not going to get your low and slow type of attacks, which is much more common with persistent threat actors. So at any rate, I think that's an important thing to keep track of just in general with log analysis and threat hunting. So just a few more words about LogRhythm. LogRhythm is doing a lot in 3 different areas. And okay, cool. Young says, yes, much agreed about the overemphasis on top X events. Oh, here's something else I want to share. David says, we saw an attacker gain a foothold, then use the account to spring to another system as a non-privileged user, and then used native Windows tools to elevate their privilege to gain system credentials and then move on to another system. Yes, I absolutely agree. And so that's, that's what I was getting at here with the limitations of the approach that I'm talking about. So you always want to be coming at things from multiple directions and being aware that each vector that you're coming into your logs from is going to be self-selecting out potentially important events. Irene says, yeah, this is great, Irene. Folks, check this point out. We do not allow logon with a built-in administrator account. Therefore, we track any usage at all. So yes, very good point. Those accounts should be break glass accounts like built-in administrator, right, that you only use as a last resort. So if you see any activity at all, you'd be interested in that. Ralph says, oh, hi, Ralph. He says, I think the concept of top versus bottom would be like file hash analysis. I'm not as interested in a high count for an executable. I'm more interested in the ones with an account of, say, 1 or some other low number. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I love it. The processes that are running all the time, just that's not interesting. We're looking for where somebody has deployed a rat on a given system, and that's how we pull the needle from the haystack. Okay, so here are some things to be aware of with LogRhythm in particular that make them interesting. Attackers, persistent attacks don't necessarily mean that you have a lot of time either, because we're seeing more aggressive automated attacks that are using initially some persistent techniques to get in, but once they do, as an example, Netya function very, very fast. And so the bad guys are using more automation, so it's important that we do that too with this constant arms race. And something that LogRhythm is doing is trying to give you more automation and orchestration so that you can react as fast as the attacker is acting. Another thing that's getting a lot of attention nowadays is user entity behavior analysis, and that's something that LogRhythm is putting a lot of investment into building into their existing SIM technology. Also, another interesting philosophy with LogRhythm is helping you manage the entire threat lifecycle. And these are all things that you can get demos on or learn more about. I've added some links here. If you want an online demo with a human, there's a link for that. If you want to get an in-depth product demo, which I think is just available on demand if I'm not mistaken, check out the bottom link there. If you just want more information on LogRhythm in general, try the middle link. And we've got another really cool webinar sponsored by LogRhythm where we'll have some LogRhythm engineers coming up later this month. That's going to be pretty awesome too. And let's see here. Yeah, Paul, if you missed the beginning of the webinar, no worries. As always, we're going to have a copy of the, we're going to have a recording made available. So, folks, I hope this was valuable to you. I try to keep this one really focused and practical. We just talked about 3 event IDs and some good ways as your entry vector for getting into these events, and trying to make it so that it's practical. And I get it that you can't investigate every single event that occurs, and so that's the approach we try to take today. Thanks again, everybody, for all of your time, and stay tuned for the follow-up email, which will also include a link to the resources if you're a LogRhythm user. Have a great day, everybody. Take care, and bye-bye.